Thanks so much, Lisa, for that great introduction. I think that was a nice seg into what I'll be presenting on, which is thinking about alignment and transitions between early learning settings and elementary school settings, and promoting continuity in children's learning as they go through the full pre-K to third grade continuum. I think that's a really unique part about our network, is that we weren't just focused on pre-K in that 1 year prior to kindergarten. We were really conceptualizing early learning as existing from pre-K to third grade and potentially looking at links beyond. So why do we in this network think that sustained high quality experiences matter? There's research and theory to suggest that children perform best when there is consistency and continuity across educational experiences. So in other words, when high quality educational experiences are aligned. This is a context where children aren't dramatically shifting what their interactions with teachers and peers like across years. They're not dramatically shifting the content of what they're learning. They're not experiencing redundant instruction. There's some effort, there's structures and systems put in place to promote continuity. And again, educational programs are aligned when structures, policies, practices, curricula, and assessments work together seamlessly within and across ages and grade levels to support children's development. There was some initial evidence before this network that transitions are most effective when they allow for easy navigation across grades and between learning environments. And there are different types of supports that we observed within the studies that we conducted that were associated with those effective transitions. Our contribution as a network was really to explore whether and how alignment and transition practices support the development of children's math, language, literacy, and social emotional skills, their behaviors, and identifying current practices that we're seeing in these different studies that we were conducting that either facilitate or create barriers to continuity in those learning experiences. Instructional alignment and transition practices are identified as malleable factors because these are things that policymakers and practitioners can design interventions to support and strengthen in order to continue to improve early learning practice and policy, as well as children's outcomes. So what did we learn? We came about this from different perspectives. And so we have a range of different findings that kind of link to these overarching topics of alignment and transitions. So first, intentional efforts to support high quality experiences across pre-K and the early grades. We found that they may benefit all children and especially those from marginalized groups. So across our studies, we found descriptive evidence that alignment and transition practices or supports for transition are associated with positive benefits for kids. However, and critically, aligned experiences alone do not consistently predict better outcomes. We found that experiences had to be high quality and aligned. So for example, in one of the teams, the team from UNC did a project where they found beautiful alignment across pre-K and early elementary school, but the instruction was not high quality. And so in that case, that's an example of alignment without quality. And in our studies consistently, we really identified the quality as being a key feature of the alignment that mattered for supporting development. We also found that aligned practices between pre-K and kindergarten are positively associated with children's outcomes within some academic skill domains. So it wasn't necessarily 100% consistent that alignment always benefited children's outcomes across different learning domains, but there was some evidence within some domains, in particular math and literacy, that these practices mattered. We also found that lack of continuity between pre-K and kindergarten environments, including varying amounts of transition practices and variation in the quality of those transition practices, may create challenges for children's kindergarten adjustment, and that might be particularly salient for children from marginalized groups. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into specifically talking about the alignment findings, and then I'll talk about the transition findings related to that last slide. So with respect to alignment, we found that alignment of structures, curricula, and instructional content was associated with sustained benefits of one public pre-K model. This was the one study that really was able to dig deep into instructional alignment because the district was implementing an approach to align instruction from pre-K to third grade. In another study, we saw evidence that children's cumulative early grade experiences predicted their later social behavioral outcomes. And we saw that pattern being consistent for children from English and Spanish-speaking families. There was further evidence that differences between pre-K to kindergarten may be difficult for children from marginalized groups to navigate in particular. And so this finding was kind of setting up the implication that a key area that policymakers and practitioners maybe should be thinking harder about are supports for transitions with an equity focus and centered on the experiences of children from marginalized groups. We found that from pre-K to kindergarten, alignment includes progression towards advanced content. So increasingly exposing children to content that aligns with their developmental stage. Whereas misalignment included redundancies in foundational content, as we talked about earlier, cultural mismatch, more teacher-structured activities in kindergarten than pre-K, and a kind of dramatic shift in how the content was delivered, and less effective teacher-child interactions as children progressed across the grades. With respect to transitions, we found that at least half of students, and especially boys and students with IEPs, experienced transition difficulties in academic and social behavioral areas as they moved from pre-K across the elementary school grades. However, sustained positive student-teacher relationships from pre-K to first grade were found to be associated with stronger social skills as children moved through the grades. We also found that data sharing on individual children is associated with higher levels of literacy skills in kindergarten, data sharing being a key type of approach and something that can be further strengthened that would support transition practices and a higher quality transition. We also found that a lack of communication and an inability to bring together pre-K and elementary school personnel could prevent effective transitionings happening between pre-K and kindergarten. And this was particularly salient in settings where pre-K programs were largely disconnected from the elementary school system. So I just want to show you two different figures that really highlight some of these findings related to alignment and transitions. So this graph is showing some findings from the MDRC Boston team's examination of instructional alignment in the Boston Public Schools. Boston Public Schools is rolling out an aligned curriculum called Focus on Early Learning that aims to ensure that instruction, including the content and mode of instruction, as well as teachers' professional development, is aligned from pre-K to third grade. It also centers really on reducing redundancy in instruction and ensuring that kids who attend the high quality Boston pre-K program are able to continue seamlessly building on their gains as they move into kindergarten. We developed an observational measure to assess fidelity to this curriculum in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade. Pandemic happened in second grade, so these are really pre-pandemic findings. And we use that measure to identify 4 groups of children who experienced high levels of fidelity to the approach across grades and are thus included in our high alignment group. That's the blue bar at the top of the graph. And then we also found children who had more mixed experiences. So maybe fidelity was high in one year and lower in other years, and children who experienced low fidelity to the curriculum across grades. Those are the children who we would say went to the pre-K program, but didn't experience high levels of fidelity, and thus their experiences were less aligned. We also identify a group of kids who didn't attend the Boston Public Schools pre-K program. That's the dark purple bar that's at the bottom of the graph. We compared the gains of these children in a regression model where we also were able to control for a range of demographic characteristics that we know are usually linked to children's academic development. And for this outcome, which is math skills, we found that children in the high alignment group, we saw sustained benefits of the BPS pre-K program for those children in math skills in particular. We also found a similar pattern for literacy skills on a graph that I'm not showing you. We didn't find the same pattern for language and for social emotional skills, however. And so there is some evidence here we're seeing that strong instructional alignment can help sustain that pre-K boost for some academic domains. The UVA team also did a study where they examined transition practices, transitions here being defined as the quality of teacher-child interactions in the classroom measured with the class. So they were able to measure these interactions across years in order to understand how changes in those interactions were or were not associated with children's academic skills. So you can see in this graph, the blue line are children who didn't experience any change in interactions over time, was pretty consistent as they move from pre-K into K. The orange line are children who experience improvements in interaction, and the gray line is children who experience decreases in interactions. The children who positive changes in teacher-child interactions were associated with a bigger boost in children's literacy skills as they went through the pre-K to kindergarten transition. In contrast, children who experienced a decrease in high quality interactions experienced the opposite, where they actually kind of fell off that same trajectory and didn't perform as well in this literacy assessment as we would have expected. Everyone kind of came together again at the end of kindergarten, but during that transition, it looked like those interactions were particularly salient to children's development in this particular domain. And they have a similar set of findings relating to social skills in their paper, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. So in conclusion, across our network studies, we found evidence that intentional alignment and transition practices may support the development of academic and social behavioral skills. We want to caution, though, more research is needed. This is a very in development area. We don't know a lot about children's experiences as they move from pre-K to third grade. And this network is one of kind of the first large-scale examples of building evidence across a variety of different settings on these topics. Achieving sustained high-quality experiences across pre-K to elementary school transition may require attention to both high-quality instructional alignment and processes that facilitate smooth student transitions. So really focusing on this transition and the key supports that children need is something that we've identified as being of potential importance. And critically, identifying barriers to effective transitions and strong alignment may be starting points for determining appropriate modifications to existing policies and practices. Really talking to teachers and educators and understanding what those barriers are may be a good start. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to talk more in the Q&A.